Hi, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you could take your seats. Good evening, everyone. My name is Becca Cheminham, and I'm a Park Scholar from the class of 2024. On behalf of the Park Scholarships Program, I'm excited to welcome you to the Gerald H. Elkan Distinguished Lecture in Science and Society. The Park Scholars class of 2024 is truly honored to host the Elkan Lecture this fall. We'd like to thank Sherry Swab, Paula Genitis from the Chancellor's Cabinet, Lisa Parks, Chair of the Park Scholarships Advisory Committee, Mark Holt, Vice Chancellor of Information Technology, and the many students and faculty in the College of Sciences for joining us today, as well as all of those who were able to attend the Celebration of Life for Dr. Elkan prior to this event, and those joining us virtually. For 26 years, Park Scholarships has brought outstanding students to NC State, students who excel in scholarship, leadership, character, and service. In 2016, the Park Scholarships Program became the new home for the Gerald H. Elkan Distinguished Lecture in Science and Society, formerly housed within the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and named for the beloved Park Faculty Scholar for the classes of 2002, 2006, 2009, and 2011. Established by Dr. Elkan's former students, associates, and friends in honor of his 40-year career as a distinguished professor emeritus of microbiology at NC State, this lectureship supports an annual talk at NC State by a prominent thought leader. Earlier this fall, Dr. Elkan passed away at the age of 92. We are so grateful for Dr. Elkan's lasting impact on the Park community. After he retired from NC State in 1994, Dr. Elkan remained active in the areas of teaching, research, and mentoring, as well as supporting the Park Scholarships Program in numerous ways over the last 25 years. As one of the first members of the program's advisory committee, he provided input on the earliest framework of what the Park Scholarships experience would become. And he helped interview nearly every employee of the program over a 2-decade span. In addition to volunteering, Dr. Elkan stayed connected to the Park Scholarships Program and many of his former students each week at the local Cup of Joe coffee shop in order to solve the world's problems. This tradition was sustained over Zoom during the pandemic when they were unable to meet in person. When Dr. Elkan proposed hosting the Elkan Lecture in the Park Scholarship Program, we were delighted and honored. Thinking about the intersection of science and society is something that Dr. Elkan did throughout his career at NC State. He taught more than 3,000 students, many of whom are here tonight. Dr. Elkan had a truly extraordinary career, and we're grateful for his lasting impact on the Park community. Now, to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, please welcome Robert.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Robert Coburn, and I'm a Park Scholar in the class of 2024. On behalf of the Distinguished Speakers Committee, I am pleased to introduce our honored guest. Professor Dorothy Roberts is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor and George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in the departments of Africana Studies and Sociology and the Law School, where she is the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mazel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights. She is also the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society, an internationally recognized scholar, public intellectual, and social justice advocate. Professor Roberts has written and lectured extensively on race, gender, and class inequities in U.S. institutions and has been a leader in transforming public thinking and policy on reproductive freedom, child welfare, and bioethics. She is the author of Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, and Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families, and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World, as well as more than 100 articles and book chapters, including Race in the 1619 Project book. Recent recognitions of her work include the 2022 election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, 2022 Juvenile Law Center Leadership Prize, 2019 Honorary Doctor of Law degree from Rutgers University, Newark, 2019 New Voices for Reproductive Justice Voice of Vision Award, 2017 election to the National Academy of Medicine, 2016 Society of Family Planning Lifetime Achievement Award, and the 2015 American Psychiatric Association Solomon Carter Fuller Award. Her TED Talk on the problem with race-based medicine has recently surpassed 1.5 million views. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Dorothy Roberts to the stage to present the Class of 2024's Gerald Elkan Distinguished Lecture in Science and Society with the topic of ending the legacy of racism in medicine. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dorothy Roberts.
Oh, it's always so nice to get up and see what a beautiful crowd this is. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you so much, Robert, for that introduction. Thanks to the Park Scholars, especially the committee that invited me, and special thanks to Dr. Elkan. I'm so disappointed I wasn't able to meet him, but I've learned so much about him since being here. And it's really an honor to give this lecture in his name. I've also spent several hours on campus today with students, and I've had a great time. So thank you for this great invitation to visit NC State. My water down. So as Robert said, I am giving a lecture today on ending the legacy of racism in medicine. And I thought I would start with an example. Is it showing up? I don't think so. The slides. Should I have? Okay.
Try again.
Okay.
Okay,
No?
it's not working still. All right. Oh, see, NC State is brilliant. Okay, so there we go. Aren't they beautiful slides? Yes, I had help with this. So, I'm going to talk about ending the legacy
of racism in medicine. And we will start with an example of a health inequity in the United States that emerged very recently with the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and it was very quickly discovered that there was a huge gap in the mortality rates among different groups in the United States, with Black Americans dying from COVID at far higher rates than other Americans, and especially a gap between white Americans and Black Americans. And so, of course, the question arises, why is this? Why do we see this terrible gap in death from a disease that is affecting many, many people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the United States? So one explanation that came up right away was that there's something innate in Black people that makes them more likely to die from COVID. And we see even in, I don't know if you can see the highlighted portions there, but one hypothesis just at the very beginning, I'm quoting from an article in Health Affairs. One hypothesis is that there may be some unknown, unmeasured genetic or biological factors that increase the severity of this illness for African Americans, multiple references to some unknown innate factor that's the reason for it, and even some articles trying to come up with a particular difference in biology between Black Americans and others that might explain it. And this is a very common way of thinking about what causes racial health inequities, that there's something innate in people of different races that makes them have these different predispositions to getting disease or dying from disease. But another explanation came from Dr. Kamara Jones, who is a former president of the American Public Health Association, which is very, very different. She said, no, it's not because of any biological difference between Black people and other people. It's because racism, not race, is a risk factor for dying of COVID-19. Racism, not race, is the risk factor. And what did she mean by this? Well, she pointed to particular risks that Black Americans have because of structural racism that makes them more susceptible to getting infected and also more susceptible to dying. So she pointed out that people of color are more exposed and less protected, more exposed because of the kinds of work that they do, the kinds of jobs that they're more likely to get, jobs that put them in closer contact with infected people, and having to travel to jobs in ways that are less protected and having less protection on the job. And then once infected, more likely to die because of pre-existing chronic health conditions that she argued were also due to structural inequities, living in impoverished, segregated neighborhoods that are bombarded by less healthy conditions, toxic waste dumps, living by highways, other kinds of chemical exposures that make it more likely to get chronic disease, less nutritious food in the neighborhood, more stresses in the neighborhood, and these sorts of things, lack of access to high-quality health care. And so another explanation that's very different is that it is because of structural racism that Black Americans had COVID and died from it at such higher rates. Now, there's been an interesting development lately. The New York Times published this article recently that there's a public health success story in the United States because those gaps that I just showed you have diminished dramatically. But the reason why is not quite clear. And one possible reason that's stated in the article is that for political, ideological reasons, white people are less likely to get vaccinated now, are getting vaccinated at lower rates than Black people, and so the gap is shrinking. Now, some people would criticize this by saying, well, it's not a success story yet because there's still a lot of people dying from COVID, and we still see disparities in who gets infected and who dies from it. But my point in showing this is that it adds to the explanation that it has nothing to do with innate racial differences. It has to do with political, structural reasons, whether it's access to vaccines, decisions to get them or not, or whether it's underlying chronic diseases because of structural inequities, whether it's who gets exposed, who doesn't, who's protected, who isn't. All of these have to do with structural reasons, not innate. But why is it, though, that there was this very quick response to look for some innate biological difference or even genetic difference between races? Where does that come from to think that that might even be a reason? Well, I think it's important to look at the history of the idea that human beings are naturally divided into races, because that's the basis of looking for some innate cause for racial differences in disease. Some innate difference between races relies on this fundamental idea that human beings are naturally divided into biological races. In fact, as I'm talking, you could ask yourself, do I agree with that statement or not? The human species is naturally divided into distinguishable biological races. Now, where does that idea come from, and why is it so commonly held, even among very intelligent, advanced scientists? Well, I would argue that it is an idea that was invented. And it was not only invented, but incorporated into Western science at the very beginning of modern Western science. And it's been embedded in Western science ever since. But we know historically that this idea actually is a pre-modern idea, and our best historical evidence shows that it comes from a distortion of Christian theology. It comes from the idea that God divided human beings into races. And that idea emerged in Christian thought when European Christians wanted to enslave African people and not allow them to be free when they converted to Christianity. Originally, the church said, you can enslave people, but if they convert to Christianity, you have to let them go. You cannot enslave a Christian. That was the rule. Now, of course, it became economically profitable to continue to enslave people. In fact, Europeans developed an idea of slavery that people could be seen as born enslaved, that they would have the status of a slave from the moment of their conception, and that they would be enslaved for the rest of their lives, that they would have the status of an enslaved person from the very beginning of life to the end of their life. And it didn't matter if they converted to Christianity. Now, in order to believe that, you have to believe that God intended for there to be people who could be enslaved and other people who were entitled to enslave them. And so they developed this idea that God created white people in God's image. Everybody else was a kind of inferior human to the ideal human created by God, and God divided all human beings into races with African people, a separate race who could be enslaved and have the status of slave, an enslaved person, in their nature forever. This obviously is a very convenient idea to uphold slavery and also other forms of domination like the genocide of native indigenous people as well, and possession of their land. And then with the Enlightenment, instead of getting rid of that idea, so Enlightenment was supposed to be a major transformation of thinking, a departure from religious thinking, a departure from relying on spiritual principles instead to rely on scientific principles. A major departure. But one aspect of pre-modern thought that was adopted by Enlightenment scientists, and you can read their work, Blumenbach and others, Johann Blumenbach and others, Voltaire and philosophers like Kant, read their work. I don't know if you've read all of it, their work on race. Sometimes that's left off the curriculum, but read their work on race. They adopted this idea that human beings were naturally divided into races. They didn't say God did it. They said some aspect of nature did it. And so they continued to justify enslaving human beings through this idea that human beings are naturally divided into races. Now, I'll give you an example of one of these scientists who thought this way, and that's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson thought of himself as a naturalist. He wrote a whole book, his notes on the state of Virginia, where he comments on the natural environment of Virginia, and that included commenting on the differences between black people and white people. And Thomas Jefferson, like those Christians who wanted to continue enslaving people, had to come up with some excuse for why he was founding a nation on equality, on liberty, on freedom, how he could say that the founding idea of this new nation was that everybody had an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He wrote that while he was enslaving his own children, the children that he fathered with Sally Hemings. Now, how could you write the foundation of a new nation grounded in an inalienable right to liberty while you yourself are enslaving people? Well, he used the exact same idea because of race. And he wrote, it's the real distinctions nature made that is the reason why black people can continue to be enslaved in a nation founded on equality, freedom, and liberty. This is a very, very useful idea, that human beings are naturally divided into races, and that explains a society structured by racism. It explains it away. It's not about unjust power. It's not about differences in living conditions because of inequality. But all of these profound inequities come from differences between biological races. So doctors turned out to be very useful in promoting this idea that human beings are naturally divided into biological races, and that explains inequities in society. And physicians were really helpful because they were supposed to understand human beings' biology. They study biology, right? They know about physiology. And in fact, a lot of doctors in the United States, or what became the United States, starting in the colonial period, but continuing after the founding of the nation, were doctors who helped the slavery system to operate. doctors were really important, even on the ships that carried enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, were critical in keeping people alive so that they could be sold. In fact, doctors were paid by being given slaves. And they were also critical on plantations in the United States to maintain the health of enslaved people, but just enough to make sure they could continue to be forced to work and their labor exploited. And they developed a concept of disease that is rooted in race. And in fact, I'll say, as I said before, just think about, what do you think about this statement that the human species is naturally divided into biological races? Think about the racial concept of disease and whether or not this isn't a common idea about disease and race, that people of different races have different diseases and suffer from common diseases differently. I think that's very broadly held. In fact, I think that's taught in most medical schools. And that was an idea developed by doctors during the slavery era in order to justify enslaving people. Samuel Cartwright, who trained at my medical school, University of Pennsylvania, the first medical school in the nation, which trained many of the elite Southern doctors. There were more doctors trained from Virginia, medical students from Virginia at Penn during the 1700s and 1800s than from Pennsylvania. And he trained at Penn. He went on to get a medical degree from Mississippi, but he then went to practice in Louisiana. And he was an expert in what were called Negro diseases, the peculiar diseases of Black people. And he claimed that he found a whole list of diseases that only Black people have, and every one of them, he said, made slavery good for Black people's health. So his major idea was that Black people had lower lung capacity and therefore had to be forced to work to be healthy, because by forcing Black people to work, vitalized the blood and sent blood to the brain, and without that, without being forced to work, he said that Black people would be chained to barbarism and ignorance. It was only being forced to work that made them healthy and able to function. And so in his theory about biological difference, slavery was good for Black people for medical reasons, and he also diagnosed among the diseases drapetomania, the disease that causes Negroes to run away. He argued that Black people who escaped from bondage had a mental disorder and had to be captured and brutally punished in order to cure them of this mental disorder. Another aspect of Dr. Cartwright's medical thinking was the notion of race correction, that because people of different races have bodies that function differently, when you use a medical device to test the functioning of a patient, you have to correct for race, because the output of the device for a white person will mean something different than for a Black person or an Asian person or a Native American person. And so he helped perfect race correction spirometer, the device that measures lung capacity. And even today, there are some spirometers that have a button for race to adjust for the presumed lower lung capacity of any Black patient. The idea is that Black patients naturally have lower lung capacity, so you would need to correct the output of their level of lung functioning because what's normal for a black person would be abnormal for a white person, okay? Now, you might say, oh, that's during the time of slavery. We've progressed since then. Well, last month, the New England Journal of Medicine published an article about how until the 1960s, radiologists and technicians would give black patients higher doses of radiation than they would give other patients, based on the belief that black patients have denser bones, more muscle mass, and thicker skin. That was into the 1960s. You might say, all right, well, this is 2022. We've advanced since the 1960s. But I want you to just think about how dangerous this is for doctors to do, and just imagine, what were they thinking? What is a radiologist thinking when they say, oh, we'll give the black patient extra radiation? You all know it's not good to give people extra radiation, right? All right, so you might say, well, also in the New England Journal of Medicine, just a couple years ago, a group of physician researchers published this article about all the uses of race correction in clinical algorithms, or in the calculations that clinical devices use. Now, I know you can't read this, but I'm putting this up here because the column on all the way to the left is all the different fields of medicine where race correction is used. And it's urology, nephrology, kidney disease, lungs, obstetrics, cardiology. And then they've got all the different ways in which race is used as a correction to diagnose and treat disease. This is right now going on in medicine. It did not end when slavery ended. It did not end in the 1960s. It continues today. One example is that's very clear, is the automatic adjustment for the estimate for glomerular filtration rate, which is an important indicator of kidney function. And still in most hospitals today, because of very recent developments, like in the last 3 years, many hospitals have ended this, but most still continue this. As you can see, there is just an automatic upward adjustment for the patient if the patient is African American, and a different number if the patient is any other kind of human being. Automatically. This has nothing to do with the individual characteristics of the patient. It's just the doctor identifies the patient as black, the number goes up. And you could see that a higher number is a healthier number. So this means that systematically black patients are treated as if their kidneys are healthier than if they had the same outcome from the test as a patient of any other race. Okay, I'm going to say a little bit more about this later, but I just want to point out that these are automatic corrections based solely on the patient's race that make a difference, because what that number, as you can see, determines whether the doctor considers that the patient's kidneys are functioning normally, or mildly reduced, moderately reduced, or severely reduced, or the patient's having kidney failure. So the numbers make a difference in how the doctor is going to treat the patient and whether the doctor believes this patient needs extra care or not. Another way in which these ideas still affect medicine today is the undertreatment of black patients for pain. It's been known for about 2 decades from research looking at how patients with long bone fractures, which we know are painful, are treated. And study after study finds that doctors are less likely to give black patients any pain medication or give black patients lower doses of pain medication. And people wondered, why is this? And doctors gave lots of excuses for this. And a study in 2016 conducted at University of Virginia Medical School found that it had to do with false beliefs that medical students and residents, and presumably doctors as well, have about racial differences in biology. They found that a substantial number of white medical students and residents in the study held false beliefs about biological differences between blacks and whites, the same beliefs that those radiologists held, that black people have thicker skin than white people, black people have denser muscles and bones than white people, and that because of that, we feel less pain. And then they found that those false beliefs predicted the biases in the treatment recommendations that the people gave for black patients in pain. Now, when the human genome was mapped, and the first map was revealed in 2000, there was another year of refining it, many of us thought that, okay, there's going to be a change. This idea that human beings are naturally divided into genetically distinct races is going to end. And we'll have a major transformation in medicine, biomedical research, and science, including genomic science, because everybody involved in that study, in the mapping of the human genome, said it shows that human beings are not divided by race at the genetic level. And Bill Clinton emphasized the unity, genetic unity of all human beings, but also might have emphasized that there's a lot of diversity, a lot of genetic diversity among human beings, but it's not divided into these big categories we call races. And so there was a lot of hope. But in fact, that's not what happened. The New York Times, for example, started to publish a series of articles about the next project after the mapping of the human genome, which would be to look for genetic differences between races, and began to publish studies, reports of studies where scientists were trying to figure out the genetic differences between races or explain different health inequities based on innate racial differences. This is why I wrote a book called Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, because I was really shocked by this development. I thought the next phase would be, how do we understand human genetic unity and diversity without relying on race? And I could hardly believe, just like I could hardly believe that doctors would still do race correction practices. And so I found that, in fact, there were a number of genetic scientists who were continuing to promote this idea of natural division of human beings into races and defining race as a genetic grouping. Instead of saying God divided human beings into races and then nature divided human beings into races, it was evolution divided human beings into races. It's basically the same idea, but just dressed up with genetic garb and a theory of human evolutionary history, although most human evolutionary biologists, they're the strongest ones to say you cannot divide human beings into races. There's no point in human history where human beings all originated in Africa and evolved in Africa for tens of thousands of years, and then migrated out, but at no point did those groups divide into so-called races. Not to mention what you do about the constant mixture of human beings with each other across borders. What are those people who are a combination of different ancestries? Where do they fit? You know, it used to be that they thought, well, if you mixed people of different races, then they're either you couldn't do it, that was the first thought. Human beings of different races could not reproduce. And that was if they reproduced, their children would be sterile. And that's where mulatto came from for the term for people who had a black parent and a white parent. The thought was, oh, well, there's no way that their children could be normal human beings. I think there's some people who still think that about so-called biracial people in America. Anyway, then I found that many were giving genetic explanations for racial inequities, like those explanations about the inequities in COVID deaths, and then recommending race-specific biological remedies for them. I don't have time to talk about it, but the FDA has even approved a drug specifically labeled for African American patients. Now, I want to give some more examples of how this idea continues to circulate in biomedical research and medicine, and then get to some of the ways in which we are finally really addressing this false idea that has caused so much harm, and both to patients, but also to research in general. And let me just give an example of research having to do with reproductive health. The United States has the worst record in the world when it comes to maternal mortality. We have the highest rate of maternal mortality of any developed nation. And I say the worst record because we even have higher rates of maternal mortality than some developing nations, but our maternal mortality rate is going up, which should never be the case in a wealthy, a so-called advanced nation like the United States. And black women have the highest rates. It's safer for a black woman in America to have a baby or to be pregnant in Rwanda or Kenya than in the Mississippi Delta. Far higher rate than white women, and black children are far more likely to die in infancy than white children in America. And this has been the case for hundreds of years in the United States for black people raised in the United States. It's not the case for African women who migrate to the United States, but only African American women who grow up in the United States have these bad outcomes. And research looking into these bad outcomes with respect to birth has continued to look for some innate biological reason why black people would be predisposed to poor reproductive outcomes, which is kind of a contradiction in the very theory of evolution and natural selection and all of that. But this hypothesis looks at, asserts that black race, independent of other factors, increases the risk for extreme preterm birth. And I wish I could spend time, I don't have time to spend on it, but just think about this hypothesis that something called black race, independent of all other factors that could contribute to why you'd have a premature birth, itself causes or contributes to the cause of premature birth. Think about it and you will realize that, first of all, what is black race? Who qualifies for that? What does that even mean? How would you control for all the other factors? Study could not have proven it, but it got a headline in the New York Times. Study points to genetics in disparities in preterm births, telling the public that genetics has something to do with these racial disparities, not proven by this study at all, but assumed by the study. So here's how, in my book, Fatal Invention, I sum up these ideas that it's racism that's embodied. And this is similar to what Dr. Jones said. It's racism, not race, that's a risk factor. Race isn't a biological category that naturally produces health disparities because of genetic differences or any kind of innate difference, inherited difference. It's a political category that was invented, and it does have biological consequences, but that's because of the impact of social inequality on people's health. Okay, I hope I can have a couple more minutes since we started late with the slides, but I do want to leave time for Q&A. So I want to now go quickly through some of the challenges that have happened very recently. I think it's astounding that these ideas, these false ideas, have circulated in medicine in the United States for 400 years, and it is only very, very recently that we're seeing real challenges to them. Ironically, one of the challenges came from football players in the NFL. And you might say, well, what do football players have to do with this? Well, you may know that a class action lawsuit of former football players was brought against the National Football League for damages to their brains from all the concussions they experienced while playing professional football. And the black players began to notice that they were being denied damages or getting lower amounts of damages than the white players. You know, they're on the same team. They know that they got hit in the head more sometimes than the white teammates, and the white teammates were getting money in damages for concussions, and they weren't, or they were getting less. Well, they discovered that race correction was going on. The black players were being tested on a different scale than the white players. The black players' scale assumed that they had lower cognitive capacity. Their brains were functioning at a lower level than the white players when they began playing football. Same idea. Black people have lower lung capacity. Black people have lower brain capacity. Black people naturally have lower kidney capacity. You know, all of this, that it's natural to have these harms. And therefore, you have to test black people on a different scale that assumes a lower level of functioning is normal. That's generally what race correction is about. The players said, we're not going to stand for this. And they went back and they resued and they got the NFL to drop this race correction. Now, I had a number of reporters call me up because they know that I work in this field, and they'd say, what's going on with the NFL? I can't believe it. Isn't this discrimination? This is race discrimination. How is it? I said, okay, but it happens in every single part of medicine. Why isn't it race discrimination in lung capacity? Why isn't it race discrimination in the EGFR? All that list, why isn't it? It should be. It should be, but until very recently, it hasn't been seen that way. So one way that it's now coming to the fore is finally, and these studies are all within the last 5 years, researchers are finally looking at, does race correction harm or help black patients? And study after study, they find it is harmful to black patients. And these are just some of the studies looking at diagnosing anemia in pregnancy based on the assumption that black women naturally have lower iron levels, so you don't treat them for anemia while they're pregnant. That harms black patients, right? The task forces recommending that we take race out of the EGFR because guess what? Tens of thousands of black patients have been denied kidney transplants based on this upward adjustment that their kidneys were functioning okay, so they weren't bad enough to get on the list. If they had been identified as any other race, they would have qualified to be on the waiting list for a kidney transplant. Okay, concrete harm to patients. And you can see some others as well where doctors are finding concrete, I mean, this is a recent one with emphysema, that this assumption that black people have lower lung capacity probably has contributed to missing emphysema in black patients. I was joking the other day, I said, I don't have enough room on my slide to keep adding. I keep adding these studies. All right. Another way a different way of addressing health inequities is interdisciplinary collaborations between biomedical researchers, physicians, social scientists, and community members to figure out community-based ways to improve health. And this is just an example of a lab at Penn run by Dr. Eugenia South, who's pictured there, that has discovered that if you take vacant lots in impoverished neighborhoods and plant gardens in them, it reduces violence in the neighborhood and it improves health in the neighborhood. And she's found this empirically and also in terms of the response of community members of how much better they feel in their communities when they pass gardens instead of vacant lots. Another is the work of students to demand changes in the medical school curriculum. So this is an article that I contributed to with the lead authors are all medical students at University of Pennsylvania. And they looked at the medical school curriculum and they found a number of ways in which these false ideas of race are being taught in medical school and recommended changes to the medical school curriculum to get rid of these ideas and to help to change and end the legacy of racism in medicine. And just one other idea I want to throw out is the idea of structural competency. Teaching medical students how to be structurally competent, that understanding how unequal structures affect patients' health is an important aspect of adequately, properly treating patients, understanding their illnesses and treating them. And so I'll end with this point, and I hope I've left time for Q&A. Okay, that bottom line, a more equal and just society would be a healthier one for everyone. I think that we have so much evidence now, it's just the willingness to do it, to end race-based medicine. And by that I mean ending medicine that's practiced based on the myth that human beings are naturally divided into biological races, and instead practicing medicine based on the reality that we have structural inequities in America that need to be ended in order to not only end health inequities, but to improve the health for everybody in our society. So I will leave you with that message, and I'm happy to take as many questions that we have time for. Thanks so much.
If you guys have any questions, we invite you all to come up to the stage and ask your question into the microphone for Professor Dorothy Roberts.
Hey, thanks for coming out and talking to us. Daniel from the class of 2023. And I have seen a lot of commercials lately about these companies that proclaim to, take your genetic material and then do that analysis. Can you share your thoughts on that type of thing?
Yeah, and it depends on which analysis you mean, to tell you what race you are or what. In terms of health risks. So first, I think we have to understand that, of course, genetics contributes to health, but it doesn't tell us everything about health. The best geneticists will tell you that genes don't do anything by themselves, nothing. They have to be turned on or turned off, and they always operate in connection with other genes in the organism and with the environment, whether we're talking about the environment within the body or the physical environment or the social environment. So all that these companies can tell you is what they can ascertain from your genes, and that's limited. And so I would just say, take that into account if you get your DNA tested and you get some kind of prediction about your predisposition to disease. It is only a very limited determination based on just that evidence. Your diet is going to make a big difference. Your exercise will make a big difference. The chemicals that surround you, the stress in your life, all these things, your access to high quality health care, all of that will also make a big difference, and that they don't know that. Now, I understand there's my son who's into this, strange, I have a son who wants to be a computational biologist, and he thinks that genes tell you everything. But he tells me that there are these companies that I suppose you have to pay a whole lot of money to them, not the $99 that you send to 23andMe, that will actually do this very complicated analysis with your genes and everything about your life and all of that. That might be able to give you something, but you got to pay a lot. Now, you might ask, why do you only have to pay $99? Why does the cost keep going down? Well, part of it is because these companies want to collect your DNA. That's what they're really getting from it. They're not getting the little bit of money you pay. They're getting your DNA. And that is an important source of information when put together with lots of other DNA or DNA from lots of other people. And so you might also want to consider whether you want your DNA to be part of a commercial enterprise, and also consider what might happen to it if it gets in the wrong hands. So those are things to think about as well. Now, there's also companies that claim to be able to tell you what tribe your ancestors came from, or what race you are, what combination of races you are. And there I have a different kind of caveat or concern about it, which is that those companies tell you these things based on their own algorithms that are private. You don't know how they're figuring this out. Just remember, DNA doesn't by itself tell you anything, right? It's not as if your race or your ancestry even is written into your DNA. Somebody has to figure out that given your genotype, what does that mean about you? And what that means about you depends on what big database of DNA they have. They must be comparing your DNA to other DNA in the database. So how they've sampled makes a big difference. So if you're you want a company to tell you anything about your ancestry, I would say find the company that has the most, the biggest database. So, because they're going to tell you your DNA, based on our algorithm, is similar to the DNA of people who come from this part of the world. And they only know that if they've sampled DNA from that part of the world. I mean, I could go on when they're going to tell you where your ancestors came from 300 years ago. Just think about how are they going to figure that out? It's all based on their scientists' proprietary calculations, their algorithms, which are based on assumptions about what ancestry even means. I mentioned to a group earlier today, I'm working on, this is a bad sign. I love Sam, but let me just, okay, I'll say this quick. I'm working on a committee of genomic experts for the National Academies of Science, which is figuring out how genomic scientists should use race, ethnicity, and ancestry as population descriptors in genomic science. This is going to be a really important report that's coming out in February, where we are examining all the ways in which genomic scientists use these descriptors for populations and giving recommendations of what they should do in the future. This is an extremely complicated process. And to go from the simple assumption that human beings are naturally divided into races, and we can just talk about the black race, the white race, the Asian race, the native race, as if those are real things that, there are concrete ways of figuring out who is black, who is white, who is Asian, who is Native. But this is the way scientists have operated for so long. If you say, we're not going to do that anymore, we have to figure out the rules, the principles for how to use these terms, when to use them, when they're inappropriate to use, what they even mean. I'm telling you, I've been working with the leading genomic scientists, and it's difficult to do this. It's super difficult and complicated. And I'll just say, for all the young people out here now, I really do believe we are at this exciting moment where finally, why is it that we just now have this committee? We're going to have the report in 2023, right? What's going on here? But we're going to do it, and it's now going to be up to people like you, young people, in all different fields. It's not just if you're in the biological sciences, in sociology, in the humanities. These are philosophical questions too, right? Ethical questions. All of this is super important, but I think we're at a moment where finally we are going to work on transforming these ideas that don't just affect scientists, they affect everybody. Everybody. This question of our common humanity, I think it underlies the most important questions that we're facing in our society today. And so I'm just happy that all of you came out to think about these questions, and I just turn over the challenge to you all to keep working on it, again, with the ethic of equality and justice and humanity and caring and dare I say, love at the center. And I have hope for the future, despite how dismal sometimes it seems. So thanks again. Sorry I didn't leave more room for questions.
All right, thank you again, Professor Roberts. We appreciate your inspiring work and your willingness to come to NC State. Thank you, DHK, for asking a wonderful question. For those of you who have more questions, you can come see her at 9 tomorrow, 9 a.m. So there's an opportunity for you. We hope you enjoyed the program and wish everyone a great night. And you can watch the recording to this event at go.ncsu.edu/Dorothy-Roberts. Thank you.